The morning Lillian Callahan stepped off the southbound stage at Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory. The first thing she noticed was smoke rising from the chimney of the largest ranch house at the edge of town, and the second thing she noticed was that the man standing beneath it looked like he had not smiled in years. It was the spring of 1874, and the land was still raw and breathing, the kind of country that swallowed people whole if they were not careful. Red mesas cut the horizon like broken teeth. The cottonwood trees along the dry creek bed had just begun to bud, pale green against the rust-colored earth, and the wind came down from the northern flats with enough bite to remind a person that April in New Mexico did not much care about the calendar. Lillian pulled her traveling coat tighter across her chest and stood on the packed dirt street, her single leather trunk at her feet, her brown hair escaping its pins in the wind, and she looked at the smoke rising from that chimney with a feeling she could not quite name. She had come here from Abilene, Kansas, carrying nothing but that trunk, a letter of introduction from a land agent named Beaumont, and a determination so firmly set inside her chest that even 3 days of stage travel over broken roads had not managed to dislodge it. She was 26 years old. She had been a schoolteacher once, and before that a farmer's daughter, and before that simply a girl who had believed the world would open itself up to her if she only walked toward it with enough conviction. The world had not always cooperated, but she had never stopped walking. Vernon Norris stood outside the general store with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed over his chest, watching the stage unload with the careful stillness of a man who watched everything and let very little of what he saw reach his face. He was 34, broad in the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with hands that showed the evidence of 2 decades of hard ranch work, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red stone that surrounded this whole country. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes, when Lillian finally caught them across the street, were a deep and complicated shade of gray that made her think of storm clouds gathering over flat water. She had not come here for Vernon Norris. She had come because the land agent's letter said there was a school in Harlan's Crossing that needed a teacher, and a room above the feed store that needed a tenant, and she had paid 6 weeks of her savings for the stage ticket and told herself she was starting over. She had not come for anyone in particular. She had simply come, but something in the way that smoke was rising from that chimney kept pulling her eyes back to it. The town of Harlan's Crossing was not much to look at in 1874. It had grown up around a trading post and a water source, neither of which had proven to be as reliable as the original settlers had hoped. The main street ran east to west and held a general store, a livery stable, a barber who also pulled teeth, a saloon called the Red Bluff that did steady business every evening, a small church that did less steady business on Sunday mornings, and a land agent's office that was really just Beaumont's back room. About 200 people lived within riding distance of the town center, most of them cattle ranchers or the men who worked for them, with a handful of farming families trying their luck along the creek bottom, and a few Mexican families who had been here longer than anyone else, and had more right to the land than the deed office acknowledged, a fact that bothered very few of the Anglo settlers and bothered Lillian considerably when she eventually learned of it. She picked up her trunk by the leather handle and dragged it toward the land agent's office, leaving a thin furrow in the dirt behind her. She was strong. She had always been strong. She had loaded hay bales at 15 and broken horses at 17, and carried her dying mother down a flight of stairs when the woman could no longer walk. Strength was not the thing that had ever failed her. It was other things, softer things, that had a way of slipping through her fingers. Beaumont was a small, agitated man who seemed perpetually startled by the presence of other human beings. He had her sign 3 pieces of paper, handed her a key, and told her the schoolhouse was 2 streets over and her first students were expected Monday morning. Then he paused, cleared his throat, and said, You should know, Miss Callahan, that the school has been without a teacher for close to 8 months. The children are somewhat feral. I grew up on a farm, she said. I am comfortable with feral. He blinked at her and she picked up her trunk and walked out. The room above the feed store was exactly as advertised in the letter, which was to say small and clean and smelling of grain and something faintly sweet that turned out to be dried apples stored in the rafters. There was a single bed with an iron frame, a washstand, a window that looked south toward the mesa, and a small iron stove in the corner. No hearth, no fireplace. Just the stove, which would do. She unpacked her trunk methodically, hanging her dresses on the 2 hooks beside the door, stacking her books on the window ledge, setting out her mother's small tin of lavender soap on the washstand. She had brought 12 books. She considered this her one true luxury. She was not a woman who owned much, but she owned those books, and she had read every one of them at least twice, and she believed in them the way some people believed in God, which was to say with full knowledge that belief was not proof, but with the conviction that it sustained you regardless. When she had finished unpacking, she stood at the window and looked out at the town and the land beyond it, and she watched the sun drop toward the mesas and turn the whole sky the color of a banked fire, and she thought, I could stay here. It was not the most romantic first thought about a place, but it was the honest one. It was the thought she had been looking for 2 years, ever since Abilene had stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a room she was only staying in temporarily. She could stay here. That was enough to begin with. She first spoke to Vernon Norris the following morning, which was a Saturday, at the general store, where she had gone to buy coffee and flour, and the 2 things she needed more than anything else after 3 days on a stage: an apple and something sweet. She was studying the limited candy selection with serious concentration when a voice behind her said, "The peppermint sticks are better than they look." She turned. He was standing 3 feet away, hat in hand now, and up close his eyes were even more remarkable, though she would not have used that word at the time. She would have said they were unusual. She would have said they were the kind of eyes that seemed to have seen considerably more than they intended to. "Thank you for the recommendation," she said. He nodded. Then he seemed to feel that he had used up his available conversation and looked at the counter instead. "I'm Lillian Callahan," she said, because she had never been shy about naming herself. "I'm the new school teacher." "Vernon Norris," he said. "I run the Norris Ranch." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the large house at the edge of town, with the smoke still rising from its chimney. "I noticed your chimney yesterday," she said without thinking, and then felt that was an odd thing to say and would have taken it back if she could. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite pain, but close to it, and close to something else too, something that looked like surprise. "Is that right?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was a strange thing to say." "No," he said quietly. "It was a fine thing to say." And then he put his hat back on, paid for whatever he had come in to buy, and walked out, and Lillian stood there with a peppermint stick in one hand and the oddest feeling that something had just begun, though she could not have said what or how or why. She would learn about Vernon Norris the way you learned about most things in a small town, which was gradually and from multiple sources, and with no one quite saying it directly until someone did. Vernon had been Vernon's wife. She had died in the autumn of 1872, a year and a half before Lillian's arrival, of a fever that had taken her in 4 days, which was the kind of speed that didn't give a person time to understand what was happening until it was already finished. She had been 29. She and Vernon had been married 7 years. They had tried for children and had not been given any, and everyone in Harlan's Crossing seemed to have an opinion about whether or not this was a tragedy, which told Lillian more about the town than it told her about Vernon or Eleanor. What she learned about Vernon's Hearth, she learned from a woman named Dora McIntosh, who kept the boarding house and also kept track of most human information in a 20-mile radius, with the dedication of someone who considered it a civic duty. Dora told her, while pressing Lillian's second-best dress for her first day of school, that Vernon Norris had not lit the hearth in his front room since Eleanor died. He cooked on the kitchen stove and he heated with the bedroom fireplace in the worst of winter. But the big hearth in the front room, which Eleanor had loved and which had been the warm heart of the house when she was alive, had sat cold and dark for 18 months. "People notice," Dora said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who noticed things. "People notice a lot of things that are none of their business," Lillian said, and Dora gave her a sharp look and then a reluctant smile, and they understood each other from that moment on. The schoolhouse had 17 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were, as Beaumont had warned, something approaching feral. The oldest boy, a rancher's son named Chet, had clearly been running the classroom in the teacher's absence and was not enthusiastic about ceding authority. 2 of the younger girls had apparently been in an ongoing war about a hair ribbon since October. One 7-year-old boy named Samuel could already solve arithmetic that should have challenged a 12-year-old, but could not read a single word and was terrified of being found out. Lillian walked in on Monday morning, wrote her name on the board, looked at them all with the steady level regard she had developed teaching Sunday school back in Abilene, and said, "We are going to have a productive year, and you are going to learn things you did not know you wanted to learn, and anyone who gives me genuine trouble will find that I am considerably harder to outlast than I appear." Chet tested this theory on the second day and discovered she was not exaggerating. He was sulky about it for a week and then, with the pragmatism particular to 14-year-old boys, decided she was actually fairly interesting and became one of her better students. Samuel she handled privately, staying after school on the first Thursday to sit beside him at the back bench and open a reader at its simplest page and say simply, "Show me where we start." The relief on his face when she did not announce his difficulty to the room made something ache in her chest. She thought about all the children who sat in classrooms feeling broken when they were simply different, and she thought about how a little patience cost nothing and changed everything. She saw Vernon Norris twice that first week. Once on Tuesday when he rode past the schoolyard on a big roan horse and tipped his hat to her through the window, which she caught because she happened to be looking in that direction, and once on Friday afternoon when he stopped into the store at the same time. She was there and they stood beside each other at the counter and talked about the weather and the state of the roads after winter with the careful formality of 2 people who were aware that they were being watched and were determined to give the town nothing to discuss. He looked tired. She noticed this without meaning to. There was a kind of tiredness that lived not in the body but in the spaces around a person, a weight in the air around them, and he carried it with him the way he carried everything, quietly and without complaint, but it was there. The weather broke open in the second week of April with 3 days of cold rain that turned the main street to mud and kept the children indoors at recess and made the mountains to the north disappear behind low gray cloud. Lillian sat at her desk on Thursday evening grading spelling work by lamplight and listening to the rain and thinking about the kind of quiet that filled a room when you were the only person in it, and whether that quiet was a comfort or a wound, and how sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. She was walking home through the damp and dark when she passed the Norris Ranch house and saw the windows lit from within and the chimney putting smoke up into the wet sky. And without meaning to, she stopped on the road and looked at it for a long moment, long enough that the rain began to soak through her hat and run down the back of her collar. And she thought about what Dora had said about the hearth in the front room, and she thought about what it meant to leave something cold that had once been warm. And whether leaving it cold was grief or punishment or simply the only way you could think to honor something that was gone, she made herself walk on. It was not her business. He was not her business. She had come here for a school and a start, and she would do well to remember that. But she thought about it. She thought about it more than was strictly sensible. The thing that changed between them began not with anything either of them did deliberately, but with Samuel Greer and a Thursday afternoon in late April. Lillian had stayed late again with Samuel, working on his reading, when the door to the schoolhouse opened and Vernon Norris came in, hat in hand, looking for Samuel, who was apparently the son of one of his ranch hands and was meant to ride back to the ranch with a supply wagon that was leaving before dark. He stopped in the doorway and looked at them, this big man with the storm-gray eyes and the carried weight of him, and he saw what was happening, which was Samuel sounding out a short sentence with the careful determination of someone doing something enormously difficult, and he stayed very still and did not say anything until Samuel finished the sentence, and then he said, "Good reading, Sam," in a voice so quiet it barely reached across the room. And Samuel's face went bright with a pleasure that was almost painful to witness. After Samuel ran out to find the wagon, Vernon stood in the doorway with the evening light behind him and said, "You've been staying late with him." "He needed some extra time," Lillian said, cleaning the chalk from her hands. "He's quite intelligent, he's just never been shown the door, so to speak." "His mother worries," Vernon said. "She thought he might be simple." "He's not simple," Lillian said. "He's exceptional, he just needs reading to be made sensible to him. He'll outpace half the class before summer." Vernon looked at her for a long moment with that expression that was not quite readable. That expression, she had started to think, was just the particular shape of his face when something was getting through the guard he kept, and he said, "That was kind of you, Miss Callahan." "It's my job," she said. "It's more than your job," he said simply, and then he put his hat on and left, and Lillian sat down at her desk and put her face in her hands, not because she was sad or distressed, but because she was suddenly aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had not been since she was young. May came in warm and smelling of sage and something green and new. The mud dried up and the road firmed and the afternoon stretched long and gold, and the children began losing focus by 3 o'clock in the way that children do when the world outside the window is so obviously more interesting than whatever is happening inside it. Lillian held their attention through sheer force of personality and the introduction of reading competitions with genuine prizes, which turned out to be the most effective pedagogical tool she had ever deployed. She and Vernon Norris began, without either of them acknowledging it directly, to encounter each other. Not always by design. Sometimes it was the store, sometimes it was the road between town and the ranch. Sometimes it was the church, which Lillian attended not out of strong conviction, but because it was the communal gathering place and she believed in community. Sometimes it was the evenings when the weather was good and people gathered on the wide porch of the Red Bluffs neighboring building, a kind of informal gathering place that served lemonade in summer and coffee in winter, and was the closest thing the town had to a social club. They talked. That was what they did first. They talked about books because she mentioned one of hers in passing one evening and he said he had read it, which surprised her, and she said so, and he looked mildly amused and said, "I can read, Miss Callahan," and she said, "Obviously, I only meant I hadn't pegged you for a reader of Dickens," and he said, "Eleanor used to read to me in the evenings," and then the air went still and careful for a moment. "I'm sorry about your wife," Lillian said. She said it plainly, without the practiced sympathy that people in Harlan's Crossing seemed to deploy around the subject of Eleanor Norris like a kind of protective padding. She said it like she meant it, which she did. "Thank you," he said. And then, after a pause that had some weight in it, "People don't usually say it directly. Circling around grief doesn't make it smaller," she said. He looked at her and something in his face shifted, something small and significant. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They talked about Dickens for another half an hour, and then the evening cooled and they went their separate ways. And that night Lillian lay on her iron bed and looked at the ceiling and told herself firmly that a man who still carried his dead wife with him like that was not a man who was ready to come toward anyone new. And she respected that. She genuinely did. And she was here for the school and the start, and she was not going to let herself want things she had not come here to find. She wanted things anyway. She was honest enough with herself to know it. In early June, A situation arose that drew the town together in a way that small western towns had a particular talent for, which was a crisis that required collective action. 3 boys from a ranch east of town, none of them Harlan's crossing residents, came through on a Saturday evening and caused a considerable amount of trouble at the Red Bluff Saloon, trouble that spilled into the street and resulted in a broken window at the general store, and a woman named Celia Vasquez being pushed hard enough against a post that she fractured her wrist. Celia was the wife of Miguel Vasquez, who ran the best leather goods operation in the territory, and whose family had been on this land since before most of the town's current residents were born. Lillian heard about it Sunday morning and went immediately to the Vasquez house, where she found Celia's wrist wrapped and her expression carefully composed, and 3 of her children sitting very quietly in a row, the way children sit when they feel the particular fear of understanding that the adults around them are not entirely safe. Lillian stayed for 2 hours. She helped with the children, she helped with the washing up, and when Miguel came in looking like a man who had been holding his jaw clenched since the previous evening, she looked at him steadily and said, "What those men did was wrong. I want you to know that I know that." Miguel looked at her for a long moment. "Knowing it doesn't fix it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's still true." After she left, she went directly to the land agent's office and told Beaumont that something needed to be done about the safety of the Vasquez family, and that if the sheriff, who was a man named Garrett with a talent for looking in the other direction when Anglo men caused trouble, was not going to pursue the matter, then the community needed to make clear that they were behind the Vasquez family. Beaumont looked uncomfortable. She did not care. She said the same thing to the minister on Sunday afternoon and to Dora McIntosh, whose information network she had decided to deploy for actual good rather than just gossip, and by Monday evening a small group of townspeople had formally requested a meeting with Garrett. It was at this meeting that she saw a different side of Vernon Norris. He was there, which she had not expected. He was not a man who attended meetings as a general rule, or at least she had not thought he was. He sat in the back of the room and said nothing until the very end, when Garrett was making noises about how these things were complicated, and it was difficult to pursue charges against men who had already moved on down the road. And then Vernon stood up slowly, and said in that quiet voice that nonetheless carried without difficulty across the whole room, "Garrett, I have known you 11 years. You have been a fair man when it has been convenient. I am telling you now that it needs to be convenient. Celia Vasquez has a fractured wrist and 3 scared children, and this town owes her better than convenient." The room was very quiet. Garrett pursued the matter. Lillian walked out of the meeting beside Vernon and she said, without fully planning to, "That was well done." "It needed saying," he said. "A lot of things need saying and don't get said," she pointed out. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A leaner used to say something like that." And instead of the careful silence that usually followed a mention of a leaner, this time he kept talking. "She said I was too quiet about things that mattered. She was right." He paused. "She usually was." "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing," Lillian said. "She was," he said. "She was straightforward. She said what she meant." He glanced at Lillian sideways. "A quality I have come to appreciate." They had reached the fork where his road went left and hers went right, and they stopped there in the warm June dark with the stars coming out overhead, thick and crowded the way they only got this far from any city, and Lillian thought, "He is almost smiling." That was not quite right. He was not quite smiling, but he was closer to it than she had seen him, and the distance between that almost smile and the weight she usually saw in his face felt like something that mattered. "Good night, Miss Callahan," he said. "Good night, Mr. Norris," she said. She walked home under those stars and she let herself, just for a little while, want things. The summer came on hard and bright. The school closed for the season at the end of June with a small ceremony in which Samuel Greer read aloud from a passage she had selected, and did so with a fluency that made his mother cover her mouth with both hands and his father, a weathered ranch hand named Pete Greer. shake her hand afterward with a grip that said everything he could not put into words. Vernon Norris was there, standing at the back of the schoolhouse with a few of the other ranch employers who had come to see their hands' children perform, and she caught his eye when Samuel finished, and something passed between them that was uncomplicated and warm and honest, and she thought, I could get used to this. She had worked through the summer, helping Dora with the boarding house for room and board since her teaching income stopped with the school year, and tutoring the Vasquez children 3 mornings a week, which Miguel paid her for in leather goods she had no idea what to do with but accepted gratefully, because they were given with pride and refusing them would have been unkind. She and Celia became something approaching friends, which was complicated by the social geography of Harlan's crossing in 1874, where an Anglo schoolteacher and a Mexican woman being genuinely friendly was a thing that some people noticed with approval and others with a narrowness of expression that made Lillian's jaw set. She noticed the narrowness. She continued the friendship. Vernon came to town less often in summer, which was the busy season on the ranch. When she did see him, it was in passing in the street at the store. But there was something different in those encounters now, a quality of recognition, like two people who have already established that they see each other and are not required to pretend they don't. He began to use her first name, somewhere in July, without ceremony or announcement. He simply said, "Morning, Lillian," one Tuesday at the store, and she said, "Morning, Vernon," and neither of them remarked on the shift and both of them were aware of it. It was at the July 4th celebration, such as it was in Harlan's crossing, that something happened that Lillian would think about for weeks afterward. The town gathered in the field beside the church for a picnic and a small fireworks display that Beaumont had organized with more enthusiasm than expertise, resulting in fireworks that went sideways rather than up, and a general excitement that owed more to relief than spectacle. There was a fiddle player and a caller, and the open flat ground served as a dance floor. Lillian did not expect to dance. She was not given to expecting pleasures because experience had taught her that expecting them was the surest way to lose them. Vernon asked her to dance with the abruptness of a man who had decided to do something before he talked himself out of it. He appeared beside her, held out his hand, and said, "Would you dance with me?" And it was almost a question. Almost. There was something in the way he said it that was more like a statement of intention, and she recognized it because she used the same quality in her own voice sometimes when she had already committed to something and was informing the world of that fact. She took his hand. She thought she would remember the exact feeling of that for a long time, the warmth of his palm against hers, and the rough texture of his work-hardened fingers, and the way he settled his other hand at her waist with a carefulness that was not tentative but was respectful. The difference being that tentative comes from not being sure you want something and respectful comes from wanting it and taking care not to damage it. They danced. He was a good dancer in the competent, direct way of a man who had learned, because it was necessary rather than because he had a particular gift for it. They did not talk much. The music was loud and the crowd was cheerful around them, and there was something almost surreal about the July dark and the stars and the smell of gunpowder from the errant fireworks and this man with his hands at her hand and waist, this man who had not smiled in years and was now definitively smiling. It was a small smile. He probably would have claimed later that he was not smiling at all. But it was there. She saw it. She saved it somewhere in the back of her mind like a piece of evidence. When the dance ended and the caller announced a break, Vernon kept hold of her hand for just a moment longer than the dance required, and then he let it go and cleared his throat and looked somewhere to the left of her face and said, "Thank you." "Thank you," she said. They stood side by side in the warm July dark and listened to the fiddle start up again, and neither of them moved to go, and Lillian thought, "I am not going to pretend this is nothing. I am also not going to push it. But I am not going to pretend." August brought heat that flattened everything in the midday hours and made the afternoons shimmer. Lillian spent a great deal of time on Dora's shaded porch, reading and corresponding with her sister back in Kansas, who wanted to know if she had found a husband yet, and seemed to regard New Mexico territory as a husband-finding operation rather than a place where a person might be doing actual work for actual reasons. She wrote long letters back that described the landscape and the school and the community with specificity and affection, and said very little about Vernon Norris, and then crossed out the nothing she had said and wrote a brief paragraph about him anyway, because she was not, in the end, the kind of woman who edited herself out of her own correspondence. She had learned things about him over these months, not all at once and not from him directly, but through the slow accumulation that happens in a small place where information moves like water through stone. She knew that he had come to New Mexico from Texas when he was 22, having inherited a small amount of money from an uncle and the absolute conviction that he wanted land of his own. She knew that he had built the ranch house himself over 2 summers, which was why it was large and solid in a way that most structures in Harlan's Crossing were not. She knew that Alina had come as a bride from Santa Fe, where her family had settled 3 generations back, a mixed heritage family, Spanish and Anglo, which was the reality of this territory if you were paying attention, and that Vernon had loved her wholly and without reservation for 7 years, and had been made different by her death in the way you were made different by the loss of something central rather than peripheral. She knew that he gave work to men others in town would not hire, including 2 Navajo men who had lost their land in the aftermath of the Long Walk, that terrible forced march the government had imposed on the Navajo people just a few years before, that displacement from Dainta, their homeland, that had broken families and killed hundreds and left people trying to rebuild lives with nothing. She knew that he paid fair wages and expected fair work, and that the men on his ranch had a loyalty to him that was not manufactured by fear or obligation, but by the simpler mechanism of being treated like human beings by a man who meant it. She knew that he was alone in that house with its cold front hearth and its empty rooms, and that the aloneness was not self-pity but something quieter and more settled, something like a man who had decided that some things were finished, and there was honor in accepting that. She was not so sure she agreed. She told him as much, as directly as she was capable of, one afternoon in late August when they happened to be on the same stretch of road between town and his ranch, she having walked further than usual because the evening was fine and she needed to think, and he having ridden out to check a section of fence line. He dismounted to walk beside her, which she knew enough about ranchers to understand was not nothing. You did not get off a horse in the territory for conversation that didn't matter. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You generally do," he said, which was the closest he came to teasing her, and she noted it. "Are you staying alone on purpose?" she said, "or just because no one has given you a reason not to?" He walked a few steps before answering. The roan horse plodded patiently at his shoulder. The evening light was the deep amber of late summer, the kind that made everything look more significant than it possibly could be. "I don't know that it's something I decided," he said finally. "I think it's something that happened." "There's a difference," she said. "Yes," he said, "there is," and then carefully, like a man moving across ice he's not sure will hold. "Are you asking about yourself?" She looked at him directly. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm asking about you first." He stopped walking. She stopped too. The horse stopped because the horse was apparently a participant in all human decisions. Vernon turned to face her, and in the amber light his eyes were not gray but something warmer, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was very unguarded and very honest, and said, "Alina has been gone a year and a half. I have not been ready. I did not think I would be ready for a long time." He paused. "I think that might be changing." "I think it might be changing too," Lillian said. They looked at each other in the amber evening, and the horse huffed and the sage moved in the light wind, and something settled between them. Not a resolution but a beginning, the kind of beginning that is not dramatic or sudden but is entirely real. He walked her back to town. They talked about small things after that, the school reopening in September, the state of the road after summer, whether the town would get the proper water cistern it had been discussing for 2 years. Small things. But the conversation had the comfortable quality of small things between people who have said the large thing first, the ease of it, the relief. At the fork in the road he said, "May I call on you properly?" She looked at him. "Vernon Norris, you have been calling on me improperly for 4 months. I think properly is a fine next step." He did smile then, fully, a real smile that changed his whole face and made him look like a younger and lighter version of himself, and Lillian felt it hit her somewhere below her sternum like something warm had started there. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. He came on Saturday with his hat brushed and his best shirt on, and a bunch of early autumn wildflowers that were clearly the product of someone's garden rather than the open range, which meant he had asked for them, which meant he had planned this, and something about the evidence of planning touched her more than spontaneity would have. They walked, because that was what you did in Harlan's Crossing if you wanted to spend time together with some degree of privacy that was not actually private because everyone was watching, but walking was considered acceptable. They walked the road south toward the mesa and talked for 2 hours about things that mattered and things that didn't, and Lillian thought about all the conversations she had had in her life that had felt like building something versus conversations that just occupied time, and she knew which category this was. He asked her about Abilene. She told him about her father's farm and her mother's death and the teaching job that had been good but had never felt permanent, and how she had looked at the map one evening and found Harlan's Crossing, which was not the romantic origin story other people seemed to expect when they found out a woman had come this far alone, but which was the true one. She had looked at a map. She had chosen. She had come. "That's about the most sensible way to make a decision," he said. "It usually works better than waiting for a feeling," she agreed, and then she thought about the smoke rising from his chimney and the way she had felt it pull at her from the first morning, and she thought, well, not always. September came and with it the school year, and Lillian's mornings were full again, and her evenings became the currency she spent on Vernon, who had found his way back to calling on her regularly in the way that a man finds his way back to something he has been circling for a while. They ate Sunday dinner together at Dora's boarding house because that was where the best meals in town were, and because Dora, who had appointed herself something between a chaperone and a personal advocate, made it clear that she approved of this development and would not tolerate anything undermining it. "He is a good man," Dora told Lillian in the kitchen one Sunday while the roast finished. "I know," Lillian said. "He has been lost," Dora said. "I know that too," Lillian said. "People in this town like to say he's wedded to Aliner's memory," Dora said, "which is their romantic way of saying they think he ought to stay sad forever, which is not kindness, it's just people wanting the story they already know." She paused. "Aliner would not have wanted that for him. She was not that kind of woman." Lillian looked at her. "You knew her well." "I knew her," Dora said simply. "She was warm. She was fierce. She loved this country and she loved that man without any kind of reservation. She turned the roast. She would have liked you." That meant more than Lillian expected it to. She stood in the warm kitchen and felt it settle. October brought the particular beauty of the high desert in autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek going gold and the mornings getting cold enough to see your breath, and the afternoons still warm and clean. The school had 20 students this year, 3 new families having come through in September, and Lillian found herself not only teaching reading and arithmetic, but also, inevitably, becoming something like the town's general advocate for things that needed advocating, a role she had not applied for and which suited her perfectly. She and Vernon were, by October, understood by the whole of Harlan's Crossing to be courting in a serious way, which meant that the town had opinions about this, most of them favorable, some of them not, and all of them freely shared. The not favorable ones came mostly from 2 sources, one being a family named Hollister who had wanted to buy a piece of Vernon's land for years, and felt his remarriage prospects were somehow connected to this ambition, in a way Lillian never quite managed to follow the logic of, and one being an older woman named Agnes Pruitt, who had been a close friend of Eleanor's mother, and seemed to feel that Vernon should remain a monument to her friend's daughter rather than a man living a life. Agnes said something to Lillian directly one afternoon outside the church, something about how she hoped Miss Callahan understood what she was stepping into, said with a certain edge that was not quite unkindness but was in that neighborhood. Lillian looked at her for a moment and then said, calmly, "Mrs. Pruitt, I am not stepping into anything. I am walking forward in my own direction, and if that direction happens to intersect with Vernon Norris's, I think that is a matter between him and me and no one else. I mean that respectfully." Agnes stared at her and then made a sound that might have been indignation or might have been something closer to surprised approval, and walked away, and the two women reached something like a cautious peace from that point forward. One Thursday evening in October, Lillian stayed late at the school marking work, and she looked up to find Vernon standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which was his standard posture for doorways, and which she had come to think of as simply his way of announcing himself without announcing himself. "You don't have to come check on me," she said, though she was smiling. "I know I don't," he said. "I came because I wanted to." He looked around the schoolroom with its chalked board and its rows of benches and its smell of chalk dust and went reproaching cold and said, "You're changing things here." "I'm teaching," she said. "You're doing more than teaching," he said. "You know that." He came further into the room and set his hat on the back bench and sat on the bench beside it, which looked slightly absurd given that the benches were sized for 10-year-olds, but he managed it with a kind of dignity. "Samuel Greer read me a full page from that almanac I keep in the ranch office last week. He came up on his own and asked if he could, and he read the whole page. His father cried, Lillian. Pete Greer wept." She felt her throat go tight. "He earned that," she said. "I just showed him the door." "You are good at showing people the door," he said, and then he looked at her with that directness he had, that way of looking that did not flinch, and said, "You've shown me something like a door." The room was quiet. The evening was quiet outside it. The lamp made a warm circle around them in the gathering dark. "What did I show you?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. "That the world is still going," he said. "That there is still something worth coming toward." He stopped. He was not a man who spoke easily about these things, and she knew it, and the fact that he was speaking told her everything. "I know you didn't come here for me. I know you made your own choice and found your own place here. I don't want you to think I'm asking you to give that up or fit yourself around something I need. I'm not." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know that I am glad you came here, and that I am not going to let this keep going past the point where it's decent to say what it is." "What is it?" she said. "I am in love with you," he said, not loudly, not dramatically. As simply as he said everything, with the directness that was just the plain shape of who he was, and with something underneath it that was enormous. She could feel the weight of it. This man who had been carrying grief for 18 months, and who had opened slowly, like a door that had been swollen shut with weather and had gradually dried back to fitting the frame, and who was now, without fanfare, standing in a circle of lamplight in a schoolroom full of children's benches and telling her. She crossed the room and she stood in front of him and she took his face in both her hands, which, given that he was sitting and she was standing, meant she was looking down at him for once, and she said, "I love you too, Vernon Norris. I have been in the process of loving you since approximately the second week I was here, and it is not a convenient or simple thing, and I would not trade it." He turned his face into one of her hands and closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them they were bright in the lamplight with something that was not quite tears but was close to whatever is underneath tears, the feeling before the feeling. He stood up. He was considerably taller than her again when he was standing, and he looked at her for a moment with that changed face, the lightened face, and then he kissed her, and it was not a tentative or complicated kiss. It was the kind of kiss that is an answer to a question that has been hanging in the air for months. November. She met the men who worked the Norris ranch that month, when Vernon began inviting her out to supper on Fridays, which Dora approved of because it was a meal, and therefore supervised enough by general propriety. She met Pete Greer and his wife Martha and their children, including Samuel, who looked at her with an expression of pure adoration that was very endearing. She met the two Navajo men, James Manibads and his younger cousin Eli, who were quiet with her in the way of people who had reason to be careful around strangers, and who she was careful in return with, respectful, giving them time to determine their own opinion of her. Within 3 visits, Eli had taught her 6 words in Dene Bizod, which was the language of his people, and she had written them down carefully and practiced their pronunciation, which earned her a look of surprised pleasure from both men that she valued considerably. She met the ranch properly, too, in the way of walking it with Vernon on a cold November Saturday, the two of them with their coats on and their breath in the air, him showing her the land he had built this life on with the careful pride of a man who knows the worth of what he has made. The house was solid and large and full of good light, and she walked through it with him and said, "Honestly, this is a beautiful house, Vernon." "It's empty," he said, and he did not mean it as self-pity. He meant it literally. "Houses fill up," she said. He looked at her and said, "I was hoping you might want to help with that." She laughed, which seemed to please him enormously, because his face did that thing it did now, that thing where the lightness came in, and she thought, "I will never get tired of that. I could see that every day and never get tired of it." She walked through the front room and stood in front of the hearth. It was a large stone fireplace, well made, with a wide mantle of timber, and it was cold and dark and had clearly been cold and dark for a long time. There was no ash in the grate, no wood laid. It had not been touched. She looked at it for a moment. "Eleanor loved it," Vernon said from behind her. His voice was steady. "She used to sit in front of it in the evenings. All winter she would sit there." He paused. "I haven't been able to." Lillian turned to look at him. "That's all right," she said. "You don't have to do anything before you're ready." "I know," he said, and he looked at the hearth too for a moment and then at her, and something shifted, not dramatically, just the small shift of a decision being made very quietly inside a person. He asked her to marry him in December. He asked her on the porch of the schoolhouse after a December evening when the sky was so full of stars it looked layered, and he said it simply and directly in the way of all his best things, and he held out a ring that had been his mother's, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone in it that she thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And she said yes before he had finished the sentence, which made him laugh. Which was the laugh she had decided was her favorite sound in the New Mexico territory, low and warm and entirely itself. Dora cried. Martha Greer cried. Celia Vasquez did not cry, but she hugged Lillian very hard and said something in Spanish that Lillian translated roughly and felt very warm about. Even Beaumont, who was not given to sentiment, said, "Congratulations, Miss Callahan, this is a fine development," which was the most enthusiastic thing she had ever heard him say. Agnes Prewitt sent a note. It said, "I hope you will be happy." It was short. It was sincere. Lillian wrote back a note equally short and equally sincere, and felt that this was how peace between difficult people was properly conducted. They were married in February of 1875, in the small church, on a day so cold and bright that the world looked made of ice and light. Lillian wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool, and her mother's cameo at her throat. Vernon wore his good suit, which he wore with the slightly uncomfortable air of a man who lived in work clothes but had made a significant effort. Dora had done Lillian's hair, which was a kind of going-to-war operation that took 40 minutes and resulted in something that even Lillian admitted looked genuinely fine. The church was full. The whole town came, or most of it, which in a town of 200 meant that the small building held more body heat than it typically managed, and the minister had to shout over the sound of crying, which was coming from at least 4 different sources. When the minister asked the traditional words, Vernon looked at her and said his lines in a voice that was steady and quiet and meant every single word, and she said hers and meant every single word. And when it was done, he kissed her and the church made a sound that was half cheer and half laughter, and she felt a happiness so complete, and unguarded that it was almost frightening, because she was not accustomed to complete happiness. She was accustomed to the qualified kind, and this was something different. They went back to the ranch that evening, just the two of them, after a reception at Dora's that lasted until the cold drove most people home. It was a clear night and the stars were back, those layered stars, and the house was warm with lantern light when they came through the door. He had lit the stove. The bedroom fireplace was going. The kitchen smelled of the cold and the warmth together in that particular combination that meant a house was lived in. But the front room was dark. She did not say anything. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, and she turned to him in the lamplight from the hallway, and saw him looking at the front room with an expression that was complicated and honest and present in a way that she recognized as someone standing at the edge of something and deciding. She went to him. She put both her hands in his. "There is no hurry," she said. "I know," he said. He looked at her. "But it's time." He went to the wood box and he took out wood that had sat there unused since before Alina died, and she helped him clear the grate, which she did not make a ceremony of, and they laid the fire together, the two of them, side by side in the cold front room, and when it was ready he took the long match and he lit it. The fire took slowly and then all at once in the way fires do, and the light spread out across the room, warm and orange and gold, and they sat down together in front of it on the rug and watched it grow, his arm around her shoulder and her head against the side of his neck, and the room that had been dark for 2 years was lit again. And it was not the same as before, and it was not pretending to be. It was simply itself, a new fire in an old hearth. Which was maybe the most honest metaphor for what they were. He said very quietly into her hair, "Thank you." She did not ask him what for, she understood. She thought about the morning she had arrived in Harlan's crossing and seen the smoke rising from the chimney and how she had noticed it in that way she could not name, and she thought, that was not the front room hearth. That was the kitchen stove or the bedroom fire, the things he had allowed himself. The front hearth had been dark through all of it, and now it was not, and she was here, and they were beginning. The winter settled in around them and the life settled in around them, and it was not always easy and it was not always simple, but it was entirely, fully real. She kept teaching. She had no intention of stopping teaching. Vernon did not ask her to, which was one of the many things she loved about him. She was the schoolteacher of Harlan's crossing, and she was also the wife of Vernon Norris, and she was also Lillian Callahan, who had come from Kansas on a stage with a trunk and 12 books and a determination, and she did not see any contradiction in being all of these things at once. The school grew that spring. 2 more families came into the territory, drawn by the land and the water situation which had finally improved with the new cistern, and she found herself teaching 23 children and managing 4 different reading levels simultaneously, and loving almost every minute of it. Samuel Greer had become her most advanced reader by March, and she had taken to giving him books from her own collection, which he returned in 2 weeks having read them straight through, and she had begun to think seriously about what his future might look like if someone helped him see it. She talked to Vernon about this one evening in April, sitting in front of the hearth, which was lit now every evening, which had become simply the thing they did, the evening fire and the conversation, and the good quiet of a house that had 2 people in it again. She said that Samuel had a real mind and that there were schools in Santa Fe, proper secondary schools, and that Pete and Martha might not have considered the possibility because it was the kind of thing that felt too large and far away to imagine. Vernon listened and then said, "I've thought about this too. I can cover the cost if Pete and Martha are willing. Sam needs to be the one who wants it, though. It has to be his." "Of course it does," Lillian said. "That's exactly right." They talked to the Greers together. It was not an easy conversation because it required Pete, who was a proud man, to consider accepting a form of help, and they navigated this by making it clear that it was an investment in someone they all believed in rather than charity, which was true, and by letting it rest and come back to it, giving them time to sit with the idea. By June, the Greers had decided that Samuel would go to Santa Fe in the fall to attend the secondary school there, boarding with Martha's cousin, and Samuel himself had been informed, and his reaction, which was equal parts terror and elation, was one of the most gratifying things Lillian had ever watched. In the spring of 1875, Lillian discovered she was going to have a child. She was not surprised exactly, but she was taken over by a kind of full-body astonishment that lasted several days, during which she walked around with a slightly dazed expression and kept touching the mantel of the front room hearth as if confirming something. She told Vernon on an evening in May when the smell of sage was coming through the open window and the sunset was happening in its usual extravagant fashion over the mesa. She said it directly because that was how she said everything. She said, "Vernon, I'm going to have a baby." He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her, and she saw something happen in his face that she had not seen before, something enormous and cautious and entirely open. And he crossed the room and he held her, just held her, his chin at the top of her head and his arms all the way around her. And he said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "All right." And the way he said it was not small. It held everything. They had not spoken directly of the fact that he and Alina had tried and not had children. She had not asked and he had not offered. But she understood, in the way she understood most things about him, that this was layered with something complicated, something that was not only joy but also the ghost of an old grief and the wonder of something finally given and the particular tenderness of a man who had not expected this. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm better than all right," he said. And he was. The summer of 1875 was the warmest and also, somehow, the most content Lillian had ever experienced. She taught until July and then let Celia Vasquez's older daughter Anna, who had been helping her as a teacher's assistant, run the school through the last month with Lillian supervising from a comfortable chair rather than standing at the board, because standing at the board for 8 hours was beginning to make her feel things she would rather not feel. Vernon was attentive without being overbearing, which was exactly the correct balance. He checked on her. He made her drink water. He finished building the room that had always been a storage room at the back of the house into a proper nursery, which took him most of June, and which he clearly found deeply satisfying as a project, coming in from the work each evening with sawdust in his hair and a look on his face like a man who was building something for a reason. She lay in the big bed one evening in July and listened to him moving in the nursery, hammer sounds and the creak of the floor, and the fire was going in the bedroom and the window was open a crack to the warm night air, and she thought, this is it. This is the life. Not the life she had imagined at 20, which had been vague and ambitious and somewhat unrealistic, not the life she had been making do with in Abilene, not a provisional life or a waiting life. This. The hammer sounds and the fire and the books on the nightstand and the turquoise ring on her finger and the child arriving, and the man in the next room building something with his hands because he wanted something to last. She was not a woman given to weeping, but she felt something full and warm move through her chest, and she thought, I am grateful. I am genuinely and completely grateful for where the road brought me. Their son was born in October of 1875, on a clear and cold autumn morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were at peak gold, and the sky was that specific shade of deep blue that only seemed to exist in New Mexico. He was born in the ranch house, with Dora McIntosh in attendance, and a doctor who had come up from the nearest town at Vernon's very determined request 3 weeks earlier, and who had agreed to stay nearby. The birth was long and hard, and Lillian did not pretend otherwise, but she was strong. She had always been strong, and at the end of it she held in her arms a small, outraged, perfect boy with Vernon's dark hair and her own stubborn set of jaw. And Vernon sat beside the bed with both her hands in both of his and looked at this child with an expression that was entirely undone and entirely unguarded, and she thought, there he is. There is the man under the weight. There he is. They named him Thomas James Norris. Thomas for Vernon's father and James for Eleanor's father, because Lillian had suggested it without being asked, and Vernon had looked at her with that expression that he had for things that got all the way through to him, the one that was not just gratitude but something deeper than gratitude, recognition maybe, the feeling of being entirely known. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "She was part of making you who you are. That's worth something." He kissed her forehead very gently and said nothing more, but she felt it. She always felt the things he could not quite put into words. That was one of the ongoing discoveries of loving him, that his silences were not empty but full, and learning to read them was one of the better things she had ever learned to do. Thomas was a loud and opinionated baby who did not sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch for the first 6 weeks of his life, and had very strong views about everything, and communicated them without reservation. Dora said he was exactly like his mother. Vernon said he was exactly like his mother too, but he said it while smiling that smile that changed his face, so Lillian took no offense. The winter of 1875 was a full winter. The house had 3 people in it and a fire burning in the front hearth every evening, and the nursery was full of baby sounds, and the kitchen was full of cooking smells, and Martha Greer came 3 mornings a week to help with Thomas while Lillian prepared for the school year coming in January, because she had decided she was not waiting for September. She was going back to teaching in January, and anyone who thought this was too soon could keep that thought to themselves. Dora supported this. Celia supported this. Vernon supported this without qualification or condition, saying simply, "You are a teacher, Lillian. Thomas will be fine. I'll manage the mornings." "You run a ranch," she said. "The ranch runs itself until noon," he said. "I can manage Thomas until you're back." She looked at him for a long time. "Do you know how unusual that is?" she said, "for a man to say that." "I know what I've got," he said simply. "I'm not going to be fool enough to diminish it." She put her hand against his face, and he turned into it the way he always did, that gesture he had that was entirely his, and she thought, 26 years old and I found this. I looked at a map and I found this. January 1876, she went back to the schoolhouse. Ana Vasquez became her permanent teaching assistant, which solved the coverage question and also gave Ana, who was 17 and sharp as new glass, a real position and a real skill. Lillian began advocating at the same time for a second schoolroom and a proper school board, because the town had grown enough that one teacher could not do it all, and because she believed in building things to last. Samuel Greer wrote her a letter from Santa Fe that arrived in March of 1876, with the kind of handwriting that made her feel that the year of staying late after school had been worth every single hour. He wrote that he was studying mathematics and geography, and that he intended to become a land surveyor, which made immediate sense to her, because Samuel had always understood spatial relationships in a way that went beyond most people's. He wrote that he thought of her every time he opened a book. She read the letter to Vernon that evening, and they sat in front of the front room hearth with Thomas asleep between them, which was not the recommended sleeping location for an infant but which occasionally happened anyway, and Vernon said, "He's going to do something real with that mind." "He already is," Lillian said. The spring brought new things, as springs do. The Hollisters, who had long been a source of low-level trouble in the way that families who want what other people have tend to be, tried to dispute a section of Vernon's property line, claiming a creek boundary had been misregistered. This was the kind of dispute that, in 1876, New Mexico territory could go several directions, some of them violent. Vernon handled it with a patience that Lillian had come to understand was not passivity but strategy. He went to the land office with documentation that was impeccable because he had always been meticulous about his property records, and the dispute was resolved in his favor within a month. And afterward he rode to the Hollister property, which surprised Lillian when he told her, and he said his piece to old man Hollister directly and without hostility, which was the kind of thing that either resolved bad blood or made it worse, and in this case it seemed to resolve it. She asked him what he had said. I said that I had no quarrel with them as neighbors if they had none with me, he said, and that I would rather have a straight relationship with the people on my borders than a successful lawsuit. And he said he reckoned that was reasonable. Just like that. Men like Hollister, Vernon said, spend so long being fought that when someone stops fighting they don't quite know what to do. The fighting was the point. When I stopped offering it, there wasn't much left to come after. She thought about this for a long time afterward. It seemed to her like something worth knowing. Summer of 1876 was marked by Thomas learning to walk, which he did with the particular aggression of a child who has decided the world needs to accommodate his ambitions rather than the other way around. He walked at 10 months, which Dora said was early, and he walked with an expression of concentrated determination that made him look startlingly like his mother and startlingly like his father at the same time. Some combination of her forward-moving will and Vernon's patient steadiness, and watching him lurch across the front room toward the hearth, which was his favorite destination because he had early identified heat as one of life's reliable goods. Lillian thought, he is going to be fine. He is going to be completely, entirely fine. She found herself in the autumn of 1876 carrying another child, which she and Vernon received with rather more equanimity than the first time and also with particular happiness, because Thomas was exceptional but he was also loud, and they thought he might appreciate a companion who was somewhat more in his size range. She told Vernon on an evening in September, and he said, in the way of a man who has already made his peace with enormous things and knows how to hold them. Good. Thomas needs someone to talk to. He has us, she said. We can't keep up, he said, and she laughed and he laughed, and Thomas, who was in the corner attempting to dismantle a boot, looked over at them with an expression of interest and then returned to the boot. The school had grown to 28 students by fall of 1876. There was now a second classroom and a second teacher, a young man from Ohio named Hobbs who was earnest and well-educated and slightly overwhelmed by the territory but good with numbers, which was what was needed. Lillian supervised the school with the same thoroughness she gave everything and had also, somewhere in the accumulated months of advocacy and organization, become the closest thing Harlan's Crossing had to a proper school board chair, a title that did not officially exist but was widely understood. She had also continued to be a voice for the Vasquez family and others like them in the territory, the families whose presence and rights were routinely dismissed by the Anglo-dominated civic structure. She had gotten nowhere with the sheriff, whose selective enforcement was a permanent feature, but she had made enough noise at enough town meetings that certain things were addressed that had been ignored, and she had the satisfaction of knowing that the world was slightly fairer in her immediate radius than it had been before she arrived, which was not nothing. Celia Vasquez told her once, in the easy friendship they had built over 2 years, "You are the most persistent person I have ever met." "I'm a teacher," Lillian said. Persistence is the primary qualification. Their daughter arrived in April of 1877, on a morning so warm and soft that the window in the bedroom could be opened and the smell of spring came in, and she was born faster than Thomas, which was a mercy, and she was smaller and quieter and looked at the room from her very first moments with wide, considering eyes that made Vernon say, in the soft voice he used for the biggest things, "She's going to be a reader. Look at her." "She is 12 hours old," Lillian said. "She's already reading the room," he said, and maybe he was right, because those wide, considering eyes moved around with what seemed like genuine assessment. They named her Clara Ruth Norris. Clara because Lillian had always loved the name, and it felt like the sound of something clear and true. Ruth because she had been her mother's favorite name from the Bible, which was not a name either of them used for religious reasons specifically, but for the reason Ruth contains, which is faithfulness, staying when staying is hard. So in the spring of 1877, there was a family. There was a ranch house with a hearth burning every evening in the front room. There was a school with 28 students and a second classroom and a teacher's assistant who was growing into a teacher of her own. There was a town that was slowly, imperfectly, and with considerable friction, getting better. There were letters from Samuel Greer in Santa Fe, now studying for his surveyor's certificate. There was Dora McIntosh, who had appointed herself honorary grandmother of the Norris household and was entirely welcome. There were Eli and James on the ranch, who had seen enough of Lillian to trust her, and who taught Thomas Navajo words with the solemn entertainment of men doing something they found genuinely funny but would not say so. There was Miguel Vasquez, whose leather goods Lillian now genuinely needed because Thomas went through boots at an alarming rate. There was Celia Vasquez, who was her friend in the full and uncomplicated sense of that word. And there was Vernon. Vernon, who had been lost and was no longer lost. Vernon, who lit the front room hearth every evening now, who had rebuilt the habit of warmth so completely that the darkness of the 2 years before felt like a different story told about a different man, though it was the same man, the same solid, constant man who had just needed something to come toward. Vernon, who read to the children in the evenings with the patient thoroughness he brought to all things, who managed the ranch and the men on it with the same basic fairness and the same basic decency he brought to everything. Vernon, who had loved and lost and had been willing slowly with great care to love again, not in replacement of what had been but in addition to it, the way a life adds things rather than substitutes them. She thought about Elinor sometimes, not with guilt and not with sadness but with a kind of gratitude, which felt strange to try to explain to anyone who asked, so she generally did not. Elinor had made Vernon who he was, had shaped him in the years when people are shaped most permanently, had given him the capacity for the kind of love he had turned toward Lillian when he was ready to turn it anywhere again. You could not separate the man from the history that made him. You would not want to. The front room hearth had gone cold when Elinor died because the love in it was real. It was burning now because the love in it was real again. That was not a contradiction. That was just how love worked when you were honest about it. She stood in front of the front room hearth one evening in May of 1877 with Clara on her hip and Thomas pulling at her skirt, and Vernon coming through the door behind her with the smell of the range on his coat and his hat in his hand. And the fire was orange and gold and throwing its light across the room, and she thought about the smoke rising from the chimney on the morning she had arrived, and the feeling she had not been able to name, and she thought, I know what it was now. It was this. It was all of this. She had seen the smoke and something in her had recognized the warmth underneath it, the warmth of a house that had been warm before and could be warm again, and she had come toward it, the way she came toward everything, forward and without apology, and here she was. Good day, Vernon asked, coming to stand beside her, dropping a kiss against her temple, reaching over to take Thomas from her side before Thomas could make his bid for the hearth grate. Good day, she said. Thomas, in his father's arms, made a statement that was too complex for his vocabulary, but was clearly intended to be significant. Vernon took it seriously, as he always did, and discussed the matter back with him with the gravity usually reserved for land disputes. Clara watched all of this from Lillian's hip with those wide, considering eyes. Samuel Greer passed his surveyor's certificate, Lillian said. Vernon looked at her with that smile, the full one, the one that had started as a small thing on a July 4th evening and had become simply the natural expression of his face when life handed him something good. Is that right? He writes that he has already been contracted for 3 jobs in Santa Fe, she said. He says to tell you thank you. He says you know what for. I do, Vernon said. The evening settled. The fire burned. The children were eventually put to bed in their respective rooms, Thomas with his characteristic protest and Clara with her characteristic assessment of all proceedings. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when the people who love each other in them have run through the day's events and arrived at the comfortable shore of evening. They sat in front of the fire together, the two of them, the way they had been sitting since that first February of their marriage, the way she suspected they would sit for a long time to come, and the fire made its sounds and the night made its sounds outside, and the house held them with the solidity of something built by hand from good materials with intention. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He asked at some point, in the way he sometimes asked questions that seemed to come from nowhere but were clearly from somewhere specific. Going back east. She thought about it seriously before answering, because she owed serious questions serious answers. She thought about Kansas and her sister and the life she had left and the map she had consulted and the stage she had taken and the morning she had stepped off it in Harlan's crossing with her trunk and her 12 books and her determination. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. This is home," she said. "I decided that the first night. I looked out the window at the mesa and I thought I could stay here. That was before I knew anything about this house or the ranch or you." She paused. "And then I found out about all of that, and I thought it even more." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the easy way of two people who have gotten so thoroughly familiar with each other's shapes that the fitting together is effortless. And the fire burned, and the night held, and the house that had been cold and dark and empty in some essential way was none of those things anymore, and had not been for a long time. Outside, the New Mexico territory went on as it always had, wild and vast and careless of human arrangements, red mesas and dry creek beds and the enormous star-thick sky. Somewhere on the ranch, the horses moved in the corral. Somewhere in town, the red bluff was doing its usual evening business. Somewhere on the road south, a new stage would be coming in the morning with new people and new possibilities, because that was what the territory was always, a place where people came towards something and found whether it was what they had expected. She had not expected this. She had looked at a map, and she had come toward a town, and she had found, without looking for it, the specific and irreplaceable thing, the thing that had been cold and needed lighting, the thing that she had seen rising in smoke on the very first morning without knowing what she was seeing. Thomas James Norris would grow up to have his mother's books and his father's hands and his surveyor friend, Samuel's sense of direction, and he would ride this land knowing every contour of it. Clara Ruth Norris would grow up to have her mother's reading and her father's steadiness and her own wide-eyed assessment of everything, and she would become, in time, a doctor's apprentice, and then a doctor herself, which was not something anyone in Harlan's Crossing in 1877 would have predicted, but which everyone who knew her at age 3 would have recognized as inevitable. The Norris Ranch would grow in the years ahead, careful and solid and fair. The school would grow into a proper school with a board and a budget, and eventually a secondary course. The Vasquez family would remain and prosper, and be part of the bone structure of the town in the way that families who had been there longest always were when given the recognition they deserved. Samuel Greer would survey half the territory and come back to visit every summer and sit on the porch of the ranch house and talk to Lillian about the books she was still giving him and the world they were still figuring out together. All of that was ahead. All of it was coming. But here in the spring of 1877, in the front room of a ranch house at the edge of Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, the fire was burning and the children were asleep, and the two people who had built this thing together were sitting in its warmth. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing, the complete and unhurried and entirely real thing, and neither of them needed anything else. Lillian Callahan had come off a stage on a spring morning in 1874, with a trunk and 12 books and a direction. She had found a school that needed teaching and a town that needed tending and a man who needed, though he would not have said so, someone to come toward the cold hearth and understand what it meant and not flinch from it and not try to pretend the cold had not happened, but simply, steadily, with the patience and courage of a woman who had always known that the right things were worth walking toward, to help light it again. The fire burned on. Outside, the stars came out over New Mexico, thick and permanent and enormous, the same stars that had been here before any of them and would be here long after, the stars that did not care about the small human drama of grief and recovery and love and beginning, but which looked, from the window of a lit and living house, like approval anyway. Vernon turned his head and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned to read completely, every shade of them, everything they held, and she looked back at him with the full directness that had always been her way, and between them was everything that had happened and everything that was still coming, and it was, without qualification or remainder, good. It was very good. The hearth burned. The house held them. The night settled over the territory, warm and vast, and full of the kind of quiet that is not empty but entire, the quiet of things arrived at, resolved, built to last. And in the morning there would be children and coffee, and the school and the ranch, and the work that never fully ended but was entirely worth doing. And in the evening there would be the fire again, lit again, burning again, as it would be for all the evenings that followed, as certain as the sun going down and the stars coming out over the mesa, as certain as two people who had found each other in the wide and unlikely world and had chosen, every day since, to stay found.